at once. It's live.
Well, it's right there. Hopefully it'll work. No. Yeah. In fact, I'm probably going to get going.
Let's wait. Let's wait. Let's wait a few moments for a few more people to come in. Okay. Keep talking. Why don't we get going? Thanks for coming to our annual research symposium. For those of you who don't know, I'm Dan Blumstein, chair of EEB, and we do this every year, and it's really a chance to celebrate, our students' successes and innovative research. And I hope if you're a student, you had a great time presenting your poster. I hope our judges ask great questions, and I hope that other people ask great questions as well. Thanks for participating. Back away from the PowerPoint. It's really an honor and a pleasure today to introduce Jim Brown, who's a distinguished professor of biology at the University of New Mexico. He received his AB in zoology at Cornell and then his PhD at University of Michigan. He was a postdoc here with Bartholomew, and then was hired as an assistant professor for a while, but then left us for other fields, a long academic career of jumping between Utah and Arizona, and ultimately to New Mexico, where he's a distinguished professor of biology and also is an external faculty member at the Santa Fe Institute. Jim's received many, many prestigious awards. I would say without any hyperbole that he is the most distinguished living mammalogist today. He's a AAAS fellow. He's received the C. Hart Merriam Award for outstanding service to mammalogy. He's received the Joseph Grinnell Medal at Berkeley, the British Ecological Society's Marsh Award, the ESA's Ecological Societies of America Odom Award for teaching, and the MacArthur Award for research. So he's sort of, shooting all barrels. And the point is that excellent researchers can be excellent and inspiring teachers as well. He's a member of the National Academy of Science and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Well, I think that his research really beautifully illustrates theory and experiments and the interplay between really a good fundamental understanding of natural history and a really rich and deep understanding of the theory that helps organize and explain that natural history. He spent a lot of time working in desert ecosystems and is very well known for his work in the desert ecosystems of the American Southwest. He maintains a long-term research site at Portal, Arizona. He's written a number of books. He's one of the founders of the field of macroecology and has written books on biogeography as well. And at University of New Mexico, he runs a really innovative course where he basically has a working group at New Mexico where some undergraduates, I think, but mostly graduate students, postdocs, and colleagues all get together, meet regularly, and solve some of today's most compelling application of ecology questions. Many of these end up being published in prestigious journals, and I'm sure he's going to talk about some of those today. Okay, so he's got major creed, right? But anyone fortunate enough, and those of you who, some of you may have heard the story before, but anyone fortunate enough to be with him in the field is in for a special treat because he sees everything. So I work at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Colorado in the summer. I'm walking by, and we have beavers there. And I was walking by this and watching these trees be destroyed by beavers, big aspen trees. And I walk by every day this particular tree, and boom, it's down, and then the next one's down. And then Jim comes to be a distinguished lecturer there. And what he points out to me coming in for lunch carrying this wheel of wood is that, look, the beavers are making wheels and rolling them down the hill to the river. And everyone at lunch it's like, I've never seen that, I've never seen that, I've never seen that. None of us have seen it. It's going on in our backyard. I'm walking by this tree every day, and he finds that beavers make wheels. So natural history and attention to those sorts of details is really good. So with that story about an industrious beaver in your mind, please join me in welcoming today's Research Symposium speaker, Jim Brown.
So thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be back at UCLA. I spent 4 wonderful years here, and while maybe you can't go home, it's really fantastic to come back for a visit and to see particularly Malcolm Gordon, who had an office just down the hall from me, and we've kept in contact a bit over the years, and so it's just fantastic to be back. Thanks for the very gracious introduction. I'll try to do well here. Let me first do a little poll. How many of you are undergraduates? Okay, good. Because I was a little worried at what level to pitch this. I gave a pretty hard science talk at noontime, and I hope I didn't spend all my creative juices at that. And this is a little light on the science that I'm going to present, but I think it has a lot of really deep science that underlies it. And I gave this title several months ago, and then I tried to put this together because I did want to give some tribute to George Bartholomew. George Bartholomew, or Bart as we all called him, was a very distinguished professor here when I arrived. He was my postdoctoral mentor, and then his faculty office was right across the hall from mine. And for me, Bart was just the most incredible person. He was a role model, a colleague, a friend, and a lot of my professional development owes a great deal to this man. And I'm not going to make too strong a connection to Bart in the talk that I want to give, but I do want to say that. We had a celebration of Bart's life a few years ago, and there is this award or fund that's now there, and it could not be recognizing a more deserving person. This guy is just amazing. But what I want to talk about is a bit about human ecology and human behavior, and some of you probably know more about this than I do. I'm a little embarrassed maybe to be doing this. This work is a result, as Dan said, of this collaborative effort that we call the Human Macroecology Group, which is sort of this little spontaneous group that meets once a week and tries to apply ideas about ecology to humans. And kind of our operating message here is that why shouldn't we study humans as ecologists? And why shouldn't we bring to bear on our own species the same intellectual frameworks and rigor of collection of data and analysis and so forth that we would apply to any other species? And so that's kind of where we're coming from. And you know, as I say, I think some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to go into the details. Some of the details we've pursued quite a bit. Some of them remain to be pursued. Some people here, like Jared Diamond, for example, have gone into some of them much more than we have. So I feel a little embarrassed, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. And so the first point I want to make is that there's this duality in the way we look at human ourselves. And on the one hand, we're unique. And you know, we understand some of why that is. We think this is largely owing to our big brains and the complicated behaviors that this allows. And the result of this has been now that we've created this agricultural, industrial, technological economy, which has allowed us to become the unique, ecologically dominant species, probably the single most dominant species in the history of the Earth. And a lot of this uniqueness of humans is studied by social scientists, disciplines such as psychology, economics, and sociology. On the other hand, we're just one of millions of species out there, and we know that we're subject to all the scientific laws of nature and all the laws that other species are, and these include the laws of physics and chemistry, things like thermodynamics and so forth, which are really important in human ecology. And the same is true in biology. And the law or set of laws that I want to emphasize today is this thing that we've started calling the Malthusian Darwinian dynamic. And I'll explain what that means. But this fact that we're just another species and that we share many aspects of human nature with many other organisms, we take advantage of, particularly as natural scientists. So we use, for example, mammalian species as models extensively in biomedicine. And we're trying to examine, as I said, human ecology and behavior the way a natural scientist would. But let me at least hark back a little bit to Barth. And one of the most interesting papers to me that Barth did was a paper that he wrote in collaboration with an eminent anthropologist here. So there was a collaboration between George Bartholomew and Joseph Birdsell. And the result was this paper, Ecology and the Proto-Hominids. This is the first couple lines of that. And here's Barth right here, and there's Al Bennett, a well-known physiological ecologist. And here's Birdsell, who did a lot of field work in Australia. And Bartholomew and Birdsell focused on the evolution of humans from primates up until the first hominids, really. And so they focused on about what we know now to be about 6 million years of evolution. And these are the particular traits that they emphasized in that paper. We could add some others to that now. But large body size, bipedality, which then allowed tool use, sociality, but sociality accompanied by territoriality, so that social groups were antagonistic to others. And for much of the time, this phenomenon of population equilibrium, so that these humans presumably were pretty much in balance with the ecological carrying capacities of their environments. What I want to focus on today is the recent evolution of humans, what I call the cultural evolution of modern humans, which has occurred in just an eye blink of evolutionary time in about the last 500,000 years, when what we call anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, expanded out of Africa to become the world's most dominant species. And this involved exponential increase in population, resource use, and economy, geographic expansion, as I said, out of Africa to colonize the entire world and set up outposts in space and on Antarctica and so forth, and has also resulted in the unprecedented ecological impacts of our own species. So, I've put quite a few pictures and some cartoons in here because often I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so in 50,000 years, our species has gone from this to this. And yes, there's been some biological evolution, some morphological evolution and things like skin color and so forth. But the vast majority of evolution has been cultural evolution. Changes in our behavior and our relations to the environment that's been passed on culturally. So what I want to focus on now is this thing we call the Malthusian-Darwinian dynamic. And I want to sort of make 2 points. One, this is a completely universal feature of life. There's no species known that doesn't obey this, I think. But in humans, and particularly in modern humans, it has a number of, I won't use the word unique, but a number of distinctive manifestations that have a lot to say about where we are right now and have some important implications for the future. And, I've done this, put this talk together this way, because I really want to talk to you undergraduates and to encourage you to use the education that you've acquired here and how you think about biology to understand the world that we've left you. And it's a kind of depressing world. I'll try not to get too much into gloom and doom. But if we're going to do anything about that, if we're going to solve these problems, we have to know what the problems are. And so I'm going to try to lay out some of that. So we've called this thing the Malthusian-Darwinian dynamic. So far as I know, this is one of about 3 terms that I've contributed to the lexicon, at least putting this hyphen in here. And it has 2 parts, right? It has the Malthusian part, which is named after Thomas Malthus, who was a predecessor of Darwin's. And he wrote his first essay, the first version of his essay in 1798. And his message is summed up right here. Population, when unchecked, goes on doubling itself every 25 years or increases in a geometrical ratio, right? So that means that population growth is inherently exponential. And you've all seen this, but I think that one of the most important messages to get across to non-scientists, to the general public, and even to a lot of our colleagues in other disciplines like sociology and economics, is the consequence of an exponential curve. So the Malthusian part is this potential of all species for exponential population growth. And this will occur whenever the birth rate is greater than the death rate. We measure population growth rate as a doubling time or percent increase per year. So that's multiplicative. And what that means is that any population, any organism has the potential to do this, and any population will grow exponentially until it is limited by resources or enemies or gets cut back by some sort of big perturbation. And so we have this history of humans. We have been growing exponentially probably ever since we began that expansion out of Africa. The actual rate has varied a bit, but we've been growing like this. And this is actually an old slide, an old figure that I showed. So we're now over 7 billion and counting, right? So that's the Malthusian part. The Darwinian part that I think it's really important to couple with the Malthusian part, and Malthus was a major inspiration for Darwin. The Darwinian part is that parents have more offspring than can survive, and so Darwin realized that there was this struggle for survival. And so this is from Darwin, 1859, about 60 years after Malthus. In the struggle for survival, the fittest win out at the expense of their rivals because they succeed in adapting themselves best to their environment. Then this is the principle of natural selection. So what we have then is innovation coming in, either genetic or cultural innovation. And since the fittest ones are selected for, they win out. And so we have adaptive genetic change in typical genetic biological evolution, and we have adaptive cultural change, particularly in many organisms, as well as in playing a huge role in modern humans. And these adaptive innovations tend to have the effect on allowing organisms to leave more offspring, so they tend to push back the limits, the pre-existing limits, and allow continued population growth. And so in humans, we have many examples of these innovations that have fueled that curve, and I'll show some more of the innovations later on in the talk. But these include things like the origin of agriculture and domestication of plants and animals and getting them to provide our food and doing our labor for us, irrigation agriculture, immunization and antibiotics to keep our diseases at bay, and one of the most recent ones, the Green Revolution, so the ability to use fertilizers and plant breeding to increase the productivity of food in agroecosystems. So the first point I'd like to emphasize is that the struggle for existence requires resources, and resource limitation leads to competition. And because of this competition, the Malthusian Darwinian dynamic promotes self-interest. And so can everybody in the back read the, I'm not going to read the, you can't read it. Well, it says eat, survive, reproduce all the way up here until this person is asking what's it all about, and it's still about eat, survive, and reproduce. So there are then these what we think of as I said, distinctively human consequences of the MDD. Many of these we share to some extent with other organisms, but they're things that have played unique role in allowing that exponential trajectory of population growth and resource use and economic development to continue up to its present state. So, and these are just some of them, and I'm sure Patty, for example, would add others. But these are ones that I think are worth talking about a little bit more. So one is group identification and conflict, unequal distribution of resources, something that has been in the news a lot with the Occupy movement, for example, cheating, the tragedy of the commons, what's called the demographic transition and the urban transition, so migration and the urban transition. And the idea here that's been emphasized by the economic establishment is that creativity and innovation have occurred over and over again and have continued to fuel this near exponential population growth. So let's just look at these a little bit. So this group identification and conflict, I think we've now got beyond the stage where we think that selection operates only at the individual. There are multiple units of selection. The important ones here are the individual, but also the family and the social group. And social groups form in various ways. They're not necessarily composed of relatives, but they form and hold together based on shared self-interest, because the survival and reproduction of the individuals depends on the fitness of the overall group, depends on how well the overall group is doing. This leads in general to mutualistic relationships within groups, cohesive behaviors within groups, and to antagonistic relationships among groups, which often takes the form, well, can take the form of everything from ritualistic context to deadly battles. And if you don't think these are inherent parts of human nature, just think about this, right? We're in it. I mean, this is a fundamental part of modern human culture, some sorts of athletic contests. And there's too much of this going on in the world and has been going on for too long. We have groups. They're formed in various ways, and these groups tend to recognize us as the good guys and the other groups as the bad guys, and the relationship between groups tends often to be antagonistic. Okay. We've got competition for resources, and I won't go into some of the theory that underlies this, but competition for limiting resources appears inevitably to lead to highly unequal distributions of resources. And John Hart at Berkeley has done some wonderful work recently on maximum entropy distributions, which are very simple sort of underlying physical principles which suggest how very simple processes produce such skewed distributions. The degree of inequality differs among societies. This is the U.S., and this is the not the 1%. This is the 1/10 of 1% here with respect to income distribution in the U.S. And this appears, we see a pattern almost identical to this in the distribution of abundances of species in animal communities. It seems to be an inherent consequence of the way this Malthusian Darwinian dynamic plays out. And this relationship has occurred throughout human history. And despite the efforts of many political and social units, most notably Marxism, to level this field, to make this distribution completely, or at least much more equitable. Cheating. Right? So even though humans form groups, within these groups there's always conflict between individual self-interest and the welfare of the group as a whole. And the result of that is that each individual tends to try to take more of its share, and the group applies rules to allocate out resources and minimize, curtail such selfish behaviors. And the result of that is in modern human society at many, many different levels, we have this co-evolutionary game between selfish individuals who try to cheat and beat the system, and then the group responds with new rules and enforced penalties. And one of my, the indelible things in my life is my grandmother used to come visit and we'd play cards. And I can still remember her catching me cheating at cards. So, the tendency to cheat and the tendency of the group to push back, I think, are deeply embedded in humans. And again, all of these things are sort of human manifestations of this Malthusian Darwinian dynamic that we see in some cases universally in all organisms, or at least in many other organisms. So here's the cheating part. And there are many, many different levels where individuals tend to cheat, and where the group fights back, co-evolves by developing some kind of a counter strategy. So an extension of that is this phenomenon of the tragedy of the commons, which is really important in where we are globally today in the way we use the global environment. So self-interest and competition tends to result in each individual tending to use more than his or her fair share of resources. Right? And usually it's just a little bit more, often not enough to bring in the imposition of these rules, but the collective effect of each individual using more than some fair share of resources is the overexploitation of common resources. And this term, so far as I know, was coined by Garrett Hardin, and the analogy is the grazing common in a New England village, where the members of the village had the opportunity, each member had the opportunity to graze their cow on the common grazing lawn. And of course what happens is that as more and more cows are added, the quality of the grazing declines, but it's always going to be advantageous to a single individual to put one more cow on. And two major global problems that we have now are, if you think about it for a minute, simply, they are simply writ globally in capital letters, examples of the tragedy of the commons. And one is the overharvesting of ocean fisheries, and the second is carbon emissions and global warming. And again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I just gave my last lecture. I'm retiring. I guess I'm sort of retired now. I gave my last lecture 10 days ago, and my last lecture was on the macroecology and conservation of the sea. And actually, this cartoon really shows data that the fisheries people have collected. They have data going back for decades on the number of fish harvested per hook in the water. And they are good quantitative data that show beautifully the tragedy of the common. The number of fish caught per hook has declined over the last decades, basically ever since we have any kind of quantitative records. So here's another way of showing that. These are data from 1960 to 2010 here. And so the solid curve is the growth rate of the human population. So we're increasing roughly exponentially, as we know we have. And here are global fisheries take. Okay, and fish are a renewable resource like the grass in the commons. But if you harvest the resource faster than the renewal rate, the extraction will peak and begin to tail off. And we've been harvesting global fisheries at rates higher than renewal rates and regeneration rates for about 20 years now. And most of the major ocean fisheries are overfished. One of the reasons this has remained roughly level is that we've fished down to poorer and poorer quality fish. And I think most people recognize this one as a tragedy of the commons. Here's CO2 emissions over this same period. And this is often not presented as a case of tragedy of the commons, but of course it is, right? That each of us produces a moderate amount of CO2, not enough to damage the planet at all. But with 7 billion of us, each producing a moderate amount of CO2, and of course, most of us here in the developed world producing more than in the developing world, the result is that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing. And you can see that over this period of, that's 1960, so this period of roughly 50 years, the rate of increase has actually been steeper than the rate of population growth. And the consequence of that, of course, is global warming, and the consequences of that for everything from people living in the Maldives to potential biological extinctions is enormous. The consequences are enormous. And so this is another example of the tragedy of the commons. And one of the things we know about commons, and for example, Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize by showing that it is possible to avoid the tragedy of the commons. But to do that, you have to effectively close a small system. So the feedbacks come back and affect the exploitation behavior. So one of my former graduate students, for example, works with fishing villages on the outer coast of Baja California, where these villages have very narrow bays from which they harvest fish. And if you have a small system like that, you can police it. So you can make sure that the fish are harvested at a sustainable rate that will benefit the village as a whole, and you can prevent the cheating. The problem, of course, with ocean fisheries is this is a global resource, and the global atmosphere is a resource, and we don't have feedbacks then. We don't have a mechanism of feeding back to curtail the individual behaviors that are causing this, right? And if you think about it, to do this is going to require international rules rigidly enforced. And we seem, for a variety of reasons that I don't want to go into, to have a great deal of difficulty in doing that. Okay, let's move along. Demographic transition. So humans, I've argued, are subject to the Darwinian part of this, that is selection to improve fitness. And not all the things that selection does, at least at first glance, appear to be what you would expect to maximize fitness. So one of the, it doesn't necessarily always maximize fecundity, the number of offspring that are produced. And we have an interesting example of that in humans, modern humans. We know that in developed nations, females have more resources than those in the poor developing nations, but they have fewer children. They have lower fecundities. And this seems to maybe violate our ideas about natural selection. And you can ask why that is, and there are a bunch of different answers that social and natural scientists will give you. And there are many things that are correlated with that, like the status and education of women, delivery of health services, and so forth. But ultimately, the point that we would make is that these decisions, the family size, especially in the developed world, they are choices that are made by individual people or by couples, right? They're deliberate choices. And why do they decide to have only a few children? And I think the predominant reason is still self-interest. There's a trade-off between the quality and the quantity of offspring. And anybody who has recently put children through college knows what that trade-off, has some feeling for that trade-off. If you're going, the figure is that to raise a child in the U.S., middle-class U.S., to age 17 to high school costs $250,000 to $300,000, right? And that's not even college yet, right? So if you want to raise a high-quality child in a modern developed country, the cost per child is very high, and the number of children you can have has to be reduced. So the result of that is we see this. And this phenomenon has been known for a long time, almost a century. It was initially described by sociologists. It's called the demographic transition. In poor countries, we have large families, and as we have socioeconomic development and improvement in the economy and standard of living, family size goes down. And this has been used by the UN to make some relatively optimistic projections about the trajectory of human population growth. And those UN projections were examined more rigorously by some members of our group. I'm not actually a co-author on this paper. And so here's the picture that we get, right? This is per capita energy use, which is highly correlated with GDP. Each pair of dots is a country in the world. And the dark dots are the birth rate, and the unfilled circles are the death rate, right? So whenever we have birth rates greater than death rates, the population tends to grow, right? That's the Malthusian part. And in order to reach zero population growth, you have to bring these two almost together. Not quite for some technical reasons, but you need to bring them down here. And so to reduce global population growth, to stop global population growth, just through this, voluntarily, through this demographic transition, we have to move everybody from here over to there, right? And this is per capita energy use, and it's on a log scale, right? So this is 100 times per capita energy use that would be needed for just this inherent tendency, if this extrapolation has any merit whatsoever. It gives you some idea of the problem of attaining ZPG. And as I said, the optimistic projections that the UN made in 2005 were that the human population, the growth rate has been slowing down somewhat. It was going to continue to slow down. They made some assumptions about the demographic transition, and that it would drastically slow down so that we'd have about 9 billion people by 2050. And the UN has just revised upward that estimate, and they're now suggesting it's likely to be more like 10 billion. And if we can, continue to have a lot of poverty in the world, it can potentially be higher than that. Migration and the urban transition. So another feature of this Malthusian Darwinian dynamic is that individuals move to improve their fitness. They move from places that they perceive to be worse to places that they perceive to be better. And so this migration is highly asymmetrical. They move from poor to rich countries, and they move from rural areas to the cities. And we call this last one the urban transition. And this tendency of people to move to improve their fitness, which would tend to equalize fitness, is opposed by despotic and xenophobic behaviors of the people who occur in the better places and have more resources, right? And okay, now this urban transition is again viewed by many social scientists as one of the optimistic scenarios for the future of the world. People are going to move to cities. They're going to have a much smaller footprint. They're going to require much less space. And there's some economies of scale in terms of living in cities and so forth. And okay, so here and this trend is going on. It's essentially universal. I don't know of any major exceptions over long periods. Different countries are at different places. The urban transition is often recognized officially as when half of the population, so this is the ratio here, so when half the population is urban, and globally that occurred just recently, but some countries like Australia have had urbanized populations for most of the 20th century. Some countries like Brazil have gone rapidly through this. Other countries like Costa Rica, for example, are going through much more slowly. And some of the poorest countries on the earth have not yet gone through, and if you make demographic projections, are unlikely to go through the urban transition for a number of decades. And from what we saw before, at least if to the extent that these are related to poverty and so forth, these will be the major engines of population growth. And it's not clear to us, if you rigorously analyze the consequences of the urban transition, that this is always going to be a net benefit either to individuals who are doing it or for humanity as a whole. So, yeah, people that move to London from various parts of the world may well, on average, benefit enormously and have much higher standards of living and opportunities for education and everything. But if they move to the slums in the cities of many parts of the developing world, it's not clear that what they might have perceived as a better life in the cities is actually realized. And there are other problems. If you think about it for a minute, the larger the fraction of the Earth's population that becomes urbanized, as we'll see in a minute, the amount of arable land on the Earth is essentially fixed. It's almost not increasing. Potentially arable land with current technology and so forth. So what that means is that the same amount of land is going to have to feed more people in the cities, and a smaller and smaller proportion of farmers, as the populations become urbanized, they're going to have to feed more and more people in the cities. And the only way that that's likely to occur was with increasing subsidies to agriculture in the rural areas, increasing subsidies of fertilizer, water, and machinery driven by fossil fuels. So now what about the future? And this is where it gets a little grim, at least in our assessment. Ever since Malthus, we've really had two contrasting views of human civilization. On the one hand, there have been Malthusians, including Malthus himself, who recognized that exponential growth cannot continue inevitably, and there would ultimately be resource limitation. It might be gradual, it might be catastrophic, but it was inevitable. And on the other hand, there have been cornucopians, and amazingly, a lot of the economics community still feels this way, that have suggested that it can go on indefinitely. And so often this results, there's a tension then between natural scientists, who tend to be Malthusians, and social scientists, who tend to be cornucopians, and often between ecologists, who tend to recognize these limits, and economists who, without the background in biology and other natural sciences, still don't recognize this stuff. And so the Malthusians, essentially say exponential population growth cannot continue forever. It's a mathematical and physical impossibility. Ultimate limits are going to be set by resources or disease. Local societies have, in fact, grown and collapsed multiple times in the past, and we tend to get a pretty pessimistic view of the future, that we're now approaching global limits, and we're in danger of population and economic collapse. And Paul Ehrlich and Dennis Meadows warned us about this in the 1970s. It didn't occur quite as fast as they'd suggested, but I think the warning is even more relevant today. So it's not inevitable that innovation will bail us out. The world is filled with ruins of civilizations that have created complex societies and have collapsed. Sometimes they've left descendants, but often huge aspects of their culture and language and so forth have been lost forever. The other side is the economists, represented mainly, typically by Julian Simon, who had a famous bet with Paul Ehrlich about the price of copper. And they point out that we've had near exponential population economic growth for thousands of years. So why shouldn't it continue? And the suggestion is that there are no hard limits to population and economy. Creativity and technology have adapted to change and pushed back the limits in the past, and they can be counted on to continue to do so again. So we can have an optimistic future with the world population by 2050 of the projected 9 to 10 billion people, and we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have that accompanied by economic progress and alleviation of poverty and disease and improvement of the lot of people in the developing world. And in some sense, so far they've both been right, both the Malthusians and the cornucopians, right? We've had this exponential growth, and we have had a series of inventions, and we've tried to just list a few of these here, of these cultural innovations that have played a major role in pushing back these limits and allowing this curve to go up like this. And I won't list them all here, but here's some of the old ones. I can't even read that first one. Bronze, so smelting of metals, irrigation, cities, the wheel, and then we go to the Industrial Revolution, and we've got steam engine and windmill and gunpowder, etc. And then we go to recent times, and we have internal combustion engine, airplane, antibiotics, vaccination, the Green Revolution, and so forth. And the one thing that I might notice about this is the last one of these big invention that I think you can justify is really helping to increase the carrying capacity of the world for humans is the Green Revolution. A lot of this other stuff, cell phones and so forth, they're great things to have, And they may play a little role in increasing communication and stuff, but they don't really fundamentally change the carrying capacity of the planet. So, here we are, and this is the world, unfortunately, we've left you undergraduates with. And it is a serious place with serious challenges now. I think if you're a scientist, you recognize at least, the inevitability at some level of the Malthusian part of the Darwinian dynamic and the limits. Exponential growth cannot continue forever in a finite Earth. It is simply impossible. We've got to stop sooner or later. And it looks like it's going to be sooner because massive quantities of energy and materials are going to be required just to simply maintain the current human population. And we're going to need even more for projected population and economic growth. So, I really like this thing about the housing bubble. But what humans have done is created this population and economic bubble that's supported by fossil fuels. And those are finite. They're running out. And so global supplies of these essential resources are being exhausted. Limits to growth will be reached. The only question is when and how and what form that future should take. And particularly important is energy. So here's again the growth rate of the human population. This is from Vaclav-Smil's book. And here's the rate of increase in fuel in non-human metabolism, basically. And almost all of this is fossil fuels. And so one of the things we see is this phenomenon of peak oil. And the population has been growing exponentially, remember. But the supply of the best resource, the most energy-dense, easily transported resource that played the biggest role in fueling this growth of population and economy is running out. And the only question, the question isn't whether we will reach peak oil, but whether we've reached it already and what the decline will be like. And it's not just oil. So what's shown in this graph is a lot of things that have helped to fuel and population growth and act to maintain the current population. So we have agricultural land, freshwater fisheries, freshwater withdrawals, wild fisheries, wood, phosphate, which is an essential fertilizer, copper, coal, petroleum, and this is the rate of growth of GDP, which is following the exponential. And what you see is, so the dark lines are the per capita rates, right? So those are the per person rates globally. And what you see is that almost all of these peaked, and many of them peaked decades ago, and they've been declining. And we tried to do this pretty honestly, so we showed the two that didn't clearly peak, one of which is copper and one of which is coal. But here's petroleum. And what you saw before was this curve for the global production. But on a per capita basis, we peaked back in the 1970s. And if you just look around, in order to grow economically, you have to use more resources. So this compares the growth rate, the annual change over per year change, relative change over this decade from 2000 to 2010 of China, which has had a growth rate of, over that period, a little bit over 15% per year, and the U.S., which has had a growth rate of about 3.5%, 4% per year. Right? Here are the rates at which these two countries have been using energy, water, copper. We've been using less in the U.S. because a lot of the manufacturing using copper is shifted to China, fisheries, phosphate, and so forth. To grow populations and maintain developed economies, we need more of all these fundamental resources, and at least the per capita amounts are declining. So, here's the bottom line, right? We hear about sustainable development. There's a big international conference in Rio coming up next month in June. And is this an assumption? We just assume that if we keep going, everything's going to be okay? Is it an hypothesis, or is it an oxymoron? Is it actually inherently impossible on its own terms? And this Malthusian Darwinian dynamic is this biological tendency to grow exponentially in population and use all available resources and adapt and push those limits. And our population has been doing that. We've been obeying this in these distinctively human ways. And this has created this bubble, which is fueled by unsustainable use of energy and materials. And, to me, the strange thing about all this is that this stuff is more relevant than it was in the 70s when Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb and the Club of Rome published The Limits to Growth. And yet we're not talking about this. This is not part of the national and international dialogue. In fact, talking about limiting population growth is politically incorrect in many circumstances. So, this is the sort of the classical statement of sustainable development. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, think about those declining per capita consumption rates, right? Those have been going down in most cases for decades. And so it's no accident, I think, that now most young people think that they're unlikely to be able to enjoy the standard of living of their parents. So I just thought I'd try to end. It's a little gloomy. So, let's end with a couple of cartoons. So if you're Malcolm's and my age, you remember Pogo, Ellie, and he says, we have met the enemy and he is us, right? The Malthusian Darwinian dynamic is part of our biological heritage. We're just doing what every species does, but using our special attributes. But it has some really important consequences. So here's this one. I'll read this one. I dubbed these into another cartoon, right? So this one says, aren't you worried? And this one back here says, no, ingenuity and technology will save us again, right? And I think ultimately one of the statements about all this, why isn't this part of the public discussion? And I think some of it has to do with this. This is a quote from Scarlett O'Hara, famous literature, right? At the end of Gone with the Wind, and she's standing there, and the smoking ruins of Tyre are there, and her dress is all ripped, and she's got ashes smudged all over her face. And she's asked, well, what are you going to do now? And she said, what are you going to do? Are you going to rebuild? And she says, I can't think about that right now. If I do, I'll go crazy. I'll think about that tomorrow. And I think another one of these human things is that we don't like to think about these things, so we're putting them off. So with that, I'll just leave this up here. As I say, this is a member of this collaborative group. These are the major players right now, and we've been supported by a number of agencies. And I better stop talking, and if there's time for questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Do we have time for questions? Patty.
Jim, a lot of those kids back there are in my class, and one of the things that they've been hearing about all term are a variety of non-human animals in which there's a similar trade-off between quality and quantity of offspring, and all of them will know that none of the organisms that I'm talking about, send their kids to college. But more than that, some of those organisms have no post-gametic parental investment. So do you want to take a stab at an explanation for why there's that same, but they're not becoming technologically more sophisticated.
Sure.
And yet there is this difference between this trade-off. It's a clear trade-off between quality and quantity of offspring.
Right.
It's a trick question, by the way.
No, well, I don't think. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And, if we think simplistically, and hopefully, some of you undergraduates have been taking Patty's course or other courses, so you realize that, just the number of kids is not the only thing that an increased number of kids is not the only thing that's favored by natural selection. Quality of offspring is really important because ultimately, at least at the individual level, the ultimate criterion is the number of copies of genes that are left in the next population. So you're right, you don't even need to look after your kids or anything, right? But I think that.
But even in those species, there's the trade-off between
Yes,
quality and quantity.
couldn't agree more.
To me, that says that there's some, perhaps, universal constraint that's not captured by the application of the demographic transition to an understanding of human demography as well. I mean, it doesn't explain what's going on in the animals, and so this fits into your talk.
Right.
In that you're really trying to make put humans in an ecological perspective.
Right.
Which includes all of life on Earth. And
Well,
maybe we do
yep.
comparisons like
Well,
for good reason.
I mean, I think, to me, that's part of this. I'm not an old-fashioned sociobiologist. I don't worry about, how many extra pair copulations humans have and that kind of thing. But, I do think that we need to study our own species. And if we as biologists don't do it, nobody else is going to. And the social scientists, I don't want to denigrate all the advances in social science, but we have to have our place at the table. The way I say it, I told somebody we've got some of our papers on this have had a very rocky history of acceptance by journals, and one of the things we did was write a op-ed piece that we sent to every important newspaper in the world, virtually about 10 of them before we gave up. And Jared Diamond said that maybe we didn't use the right strategy, right? But and it was entitled, it's also about resources, not just jobs and deficits. And if you look at the way many social scientists think about things, they think about all of the intrinsic things in the human society, right? We're going to get ourselves out of this economic problem by tweaking all the dials of how we divide up the money and stuff, right? And totally lost sight of is this whole other side, that half of the economy is about extracting resources from the environment and using it to support all these human endeavors, right? And it's amazing. I don't know how many of you, I never took an undergraduate economics course. I don't know whether that's a blessing in disguise now. But we surveyed the 9 most used introductory economics texts, right? For the entry in the index of energy. One of those 9 had had it indexed at all. And the one that did had this minor perfunctory thing. And in general, we turn on the TV every night. We hear about all this economic problems. We hear about the price of oil and what happens if the Straits of Hormuz get shut off and all that. And those are, in general, not put together for our society to understand what the hell's going on. The media, when they talk to people, they don't talk. If they talk to people and get quotes, they don't get them from the right people. Malcolm. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a utopian, wishful thinking kind of experience, but he really thinks that human behavior is likely to be more possible ways of moderating some of these.
Yeah, and he's founded this thing called MAHAB, Millennium Assessment of Human Behavior. I've actually got to know Paul reasonably well over the last few years. And on the one hand, you're absolutely right. On the other hand, we had him out a little over a year ago now, for our interdisciplinary course, interdisciplinary group here. And, I said, that in some ways, I feel embarrassed because I feel like I'm just sort of following in the footsteps of Ehrlich, 60 years later, and not really saying anything new. I said, I've read some of your recent stuff, and I said, except I think I'm much more pessimistic than you are. And he told me in his email that he'd been hesitant to sort of almost say this out loud and personally conflicted, but he's even more pessimistic than he was in 1970. And we walked around in the field and watched birds, and I think when you push Paul, he wouldn't agree with everything I said probably, but I don't think he has a rosy view. It's interesting. There are a number of really good books on this stuff. There's a book on economics and energy and economics by Charlie Hall and Kevin Klitgard, and and it lays out all this stuff up to where we are now, and then the last paragraph is why we're optimistic. And there may be reasons to be optimistic, but my assessment is there are only going to be good, defensible reasons to be optimistic if we start pretty damn soon in recognizing the magnitude of this problem and figuring out how we're going to deflate this bubble so it goes down gradually rather than pops.
I think there are about 100 reasons for optimism in this room right now.
Right.
For UCLA graduates who go out and solve these problems. And I would just like to thank you again for coming and giving two stimulating talks.
Right. Now all I've got to do is stay awake for the next few hours, right? I'm pretty good so far.